Most people know the familiar story of how the First World War began. On June 28, 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated in Sarajevo. Austria-Hungary blamed Serbia, Russia mobilized, Germany backed Austria-Hungary, France stood behind Russia, Britain entered after Germany invaded Belgium. Within weeks, Europe was at war. That sequence is real, but it explains the trigger better than it explains the explosion. The assassination mattered because it happened in a Europe that had spent decades becoming more competitive, more heavily armed, more financially entangled, and more fearful of its rivals. The continent was already carrying an enormous amount of political and economic pressure. Sarajevo released it. To understand why one assassination could lead to a war involving tens of millions of people, you have to go back much further than 1914. You have to look at what Europe had become by the end of the 19th century, and not merely on a map, on a balance sheet. By the 1890s, Europe was experiencing industrial growth on a scale the world had never seen. Germany was at the center of that transformation. The German Empire had existed only since 1871, when Prussia and the other German states were unified after victory over France in the Franco-Prussian War. Yet within a generation, Germany became an industrial giant. Its steel production surged. Its chemical companies dominated important global markets. Its electrical and engineering firms became international leaders. Its population climbed from roughly 41 million at unification to nearly 67 million by the eve of the First World War. By 1913, Germany had become one of the most powerful industrial economies on Earth. That rise terrified Britain. For most of the 19th century, Britain had been the workshop of the world. British factories supplied global markets. British merchant ships carried international trade. The Royal Navy controlled the sea lanes. London served as the financial center of the global economy. The pound sterling was the dominant international currency. And Britain ruled an empire covering roughly 1/4 of the world's land surface. But its industrial dominance was weakening. In 1870, Britain accounted for an extraordinary share of world manufacturing output. By 1913, that share had fallen sharply. Germany was catching up, and in some industries had already surpassed it. The implications went far beyond national pride. Britain's global position depended heavily on naval supremacy and financial dominance. A Germany capable of challenging both threatened the foundations of the British imperial system. Under Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, Germany had largely avoided that confrontation. Bismarck understood Germany's dangerous geographic position. France sat to the west. Russia sat to the east. An aggressive German foreign policy could easily unite both against Berlin. So Bismarck concentrated on diplomacy. He managed rivalries, he built alliances. He tried to prevent Germany from becoming surrounded. Then Kaiser Wilhelm II came to the throne in 1888. Wilhelm wanted something larger. He dismissed Bismarck and embraced a policy known as Weltpolitik, world policy. Germany would no longer be content merely to dominate Central Europe. It wanted colonies, it wanted naval power, it wanted overseas markets. It wanted what German leaders called a place in the sun. That ambition is often described simply as nationalism or militarism, but there was an economic dimension as well. Germany's factories needed raw materials, its exporters needed markets, its banks possessed increasing quantities of capital-seeking profitable investments. The imperial competition of the late 19th century was therefore not simply a contest over flags. Colonies could provide rubber, copper, cotton, minerals, food, oil, labor, and consumers. Britain, France, Belgium, and the Netherlands already controlled enormous colonial systems. Germany had unified late. By the time it joined the imperial scramble, much of the world had already been divided. The British economist J.A. Hobson argued in 1902 that this new imperialism was closely connected to the search for investment opportunities. Industrial economies, he argued, generated pools of wealth that could seek higher returns abroad. Colonies provided one answer: cheap resources, new infrastructure projects, protected markets, and opportunities for banks and investors. Germany possessed powerful financial institutions eager to participate. Among the most important were large banks such as Deutsche Bank. And no project captured Germany's economic ambitions more dramatically than a railway stretching toward the Middle East, the Berlin to Baghdad Railway. The project began modestly. In 1888, a German-backed consortium received an Ottoman concession to construct a railway from Istanbul into Anatolia, but the larger vision became far more ambitious. German financiers and engineers imagined a transportation corridor running from Central Europe through the Balkans, across Ottoman territory, toward Baghdad, and eventually the Persian Gulf. The strategic implications were enormous. A continuous rail link could connect German industry directly with Middle Eastern markets. It could reduce dependence on sea routes controlled by Britain. It could bypass the Suez Canal. And it could bring Germany closer to regions that were beginning to attract intense interest for another reason. Oil in 1908, a major petroleum discovery, was made in Persia, in what is now Iran. European governments immediately understood that oil was becoming a strategic resource. Britain was already moving the Royal Navy away from coal and toward oil-burning ships. Oil offered important advantages for warships, but unlike coal, Britain possessed limited domestic supplies. Access to secure overseas petroleum therefore became a matter of national security. The Anglo-Persian Oil Company emerged from the Persian discoveries. The British government eventually acquired a major stake shortly before the war. Meanwhile, the oil potential of Mesopotamia, especially around Mosul and Kirkuk, was attracting growing attention. A German railway stretching toward Baghdad and the Persian Gulf therefore looked different depending on which capital was examining the map. To Berlin, it promised economic expansion. To London, it threatened British sea routes and influence in the Middle East. To Russia, increased German penetration of the Ottoman Empire threatened its interests around the Caucasus and Central Asia. To France, German expansion threatened both strategic influence and extensive French investments elsewhere. These economic relationships also helped give the alliance system its strength. France had invested enormous sums in Russia. By 1914, French investors held billions of francs in Russian government bonds. French capital helped finance Russian railroads and state modernization. The Franco-Russian alliance therefore rested on more than military planning. The two countries were financially connected. Britain's later understanding with France and Russia created what became the Triple Entente. Germany stood with Austria-Hungary in the opposing bloc, with Italy formally linked as well. The alliances mattered enormously. But they existed inside a deeper network of loans, investments, commercial interests, imperial competition, and strategic fears. Then came the arms race. Europe's governments were not simply preparing for war. They were building industries around preparation for war. Some of the largest corporations in Europe manufactured weapons. In Germany, Krupp became synonymous with artillery and heavy industry. Britain had firms such as Vickers and Armstrong Whitworth. France had Schneider Kreutzach. These companies maintained extremely close relationships with governments, but their business was often international. Weapons manufacturers did not necessarily sell only to their own countries. German, British, and French firms exported artillery, warships, rifles, and military technology across the world. Potential enemies could purchase weapons from the same industries that equipped their future opponents. The system was profitable, and it had its own logic. If one country acquired new weapons, its rivals felt compelled to respond. Then the first country responded to the response. Nowhere was that cycle more visible than at sea. In 1906, Britain launched HMS Dreadnought. The ship transformed naval warfare. Its heavy guns, speed, and design made older battleships appear obsolete almost overnight. Britain had created the world's most advanced battleship. It had also accidentally reset the naval competition. Germany could now challenge British superiority by building ships of the new type rather than trying to match the Royal Navy's enormous fleet of older vessels. Berlin expanded its naval construction. Britain responded. Then Germany responded again. Between 1906 and 1914, both powers spent enormous sums on dreadnoughts and battlecruisers. Each new ship became evidence that the rival was preparing for war. Every naval budget justified the next, shipyards expanded, steel companies profited. Arms manufacturers prospered. Politicians warned their populations about falling behind. The competition was not limited to Britain and Germany. France, Russia, Austria-Hungary, Italy, the Ottoman Empire, and other powers all invested heavily in modern weapons. The armies grew too. Germany maintained hundreds of thousands of soldiers in peacetime and could mobilize millions during war. France fielded an enormous army despite its smaller population. Russia possessed the largest standing army in Europe. Military railways were designed around mobilization schedules. Staff officers calculated exactly how many trains would be required to move millions of men toward national borders. Artillery became more powerful. Machine guns became more efficient. Industrial chemistry opened new possibilities for explosives and eventually poison gas. Europe had transformed warfare into an industrial system. And that transformation created a dangerous new reality. Mobilization itself became threatening. Once one country began moving millions of soldiers and thousands of trains, its neighbors could not easily wait to discover whether the movement was defensive. They had to mobilize too. Military planning compressed political decision-making into days and even hours. By 1914, Europe was not simply divided by alliances. It was connected to enormous military machines that had been designed to operate quickly once activated. The weapons existed, the armies existed, the rail schedules existed, the financial networks sustaining them existed. The imperial rivalries already stretched from Africa to the Middle East and Asia. The great powers increasingly feared that time was working against them. Then, in June 1914, a Serbian nationalist fired 2 shots in Sarajevo. The assassination did not create this system. It activated it, and once the July crisis began, Europe would discover that the most important question was no longer whether war was possible. It was which governments were willing to choose it. Once the crisis began in the summer of 1914, the machinery Europe had spent decades building started to move, and the central question became responsibility. Who actually chose war for decades after the fighting ended? The answer seemed simple. Germany. The Treaty of Versailles placed primary responsibility on Germany and its allies. Germany had given Austria-Hungary the famous blank check of support after the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Germany declared war on Russia and France. German troops invaded neutral Belgium. From the Allied perspective, the case appeared overwhelming. But history rarely stays that simple. During the 1920s and 1930s, revisionist historians began challenging the idea that Germany alone had caused the catastrophe. They pointed toward Russia's mobilization. They emphasized France's support for Russia. They criticized Britain for failing to make its intentions clear early enough. The argument shifted. Instead of one aggressor deliberately starting the war, Europe was increasingly described as having stumbled into it. Former British Prime Minister David Lloyd George famously suggested that the continent had somehow slipped into the catastrophe. That interpretation was comforting. It turned the First World War into a tragedy of misunderstanding. Everyone made mistakes. No one truly wanted what followed. Then, in 1961, German historian Fritz Fischer shattered that consensus. Working with archival material, Fischer argued that Germany had been far more expansionist and deliberate than the revisionist narrative admitted. His most famous evidence was the September Program, drafted in September 1914. Only weeks after the war began, the document outlined sweeping German war aims. Luxembourg would be absorbed, Belgium would be reduced to dependence, France would surrender territory and be weakened permanently. A German-dominated economic bloc would stretch across Central Europe. Colonial possessions in Africa would expand. Fischer argued that these ambitions were not invented after fighting began. They reflected ideas that had circulated for years among German political leaders, military officers, industrialists, nationalist organizations, and economic elites. In his interpretation, the July crisis did not trap Germany. It offered Berlin an opportunity. The reaction inside Germany was ferocious. Fischer was accused of dishonoring his country. Senior historians attacked him. The controversy became about more than 1914. It touched Germany's entire 20th century history and raised the disturbing possibility that aggressive expansion before the First World War had deeper continuities with what came later. But Fischer had forced historians to take German ambitions seriously again, and the economic interests behind those ambitions were difficult to ignore. Industrial groups wanted markets, agrarian elites wanted influence and territory. Banks had invested heavily abroad. Deutsche Bank had enormous interests tied to Ottoman development and the Baghdad Railway. Krupp and other armaments firms profited from military expansion. Nationalist organizations such as the Pan-German League promoted a more aggressive global role. None of this means industrialists secretly ordered the government to begin a world war for profit. History was not that mechanical. But economic ambition, military strategy, domestic politics, and nationalism were deeply intertwined. By 1914, Germany had spent years demanding greater influence and building the military power required to support that demand. Yet Germany was not acting alone. Russia also made an extraordinarily dangerous decision. On July 30th, 1914, Russia ordered general mobilization. To Russian leaders, the decision made sense. Austria-Hungary was moving against Serbia, a Slavic state with deep political and cultural connections to Russia. If Russia allowed Serbia to be crushed, its influence in the Balkans could collapse. Russia had already suffered humiliation when Austria-Hungary annexed Bosnia-Herzegovina in 1908. Backing down again would make the empire appear weak. But German military planners viewed Russian mobilization as something close to a declaration of war. Germany faced the geographic nightmare that had shaped its strategy for decades. France in the west, Russia in the east, a two-front war. The German general staff believed it could not simply wait for Russia's enormous army to mobilize. Its war plan depended on defeating France quickly and then shifting forces east before Russia completed its slower mobilization. That logic made timing everything, and it created a terrifying dynamic. Russian mobilization pushed Germany toward mobilization. German mobilization pushed Germany toward attacking France. The route to France ran through Belgium, and invading Belgium risked bringing Britain into the conflict. Military planning had transformed political uncertainty into a countdown. Germany also believed time was working against it in a broader sense. Russia was modernizing rapidly. French loans were helping finance Russian railways, military expansion, and industrial development. German generals feared that within a few years, Russia might become too powerful to defeat. Some began thinking in terms of preventive war. If a confrontation with Russia was inevitable, better to fight sooner rather than later. That belief made the summer of 1914 even more dangerous. Russia was not the only Entente power willing to take risks. France had its own history with Germany. The defeat of 1871 had left deep scars. Germany had annexed Alsace-Lorraine. For more than 40 years, recovering those territories remained part of French national consciousness. French military planning reflected an aggressive determination to attack rapidly if war came. Plan Fistia envisioned major offensives toward the German frontier. French leaders also depended on Russia. If Russia were humiliated by Austria, Hungary, and Germany, France might eventually find itself isolated against a stronger German empire. So when French President Raymond Poincaré visited St. Petersburg during the July crisis, France encouraged Russia to stand firm. France did not create the crisis, but it was not simply dragged helplessly into it either. Then there was Britain. Britain later justified intervention principally through Germany's invasion of neutral Belgium. That violation was real. Britain had treaty obligations connected to Belgian neutrality, and the German invasion created widespread outrage. But British strategy went far beyond Belgium. London could not comfortably accept a Europe dominated by Germany. If France were defeated and Germany controlled the Channel coast, Britain's security would be fundamentally altered. A German victory could also give Berlin enormous influence over European trade, finance, ports, and naval power. Britain's leaders therefore faced an imperial calculation. Could Britain remain the dominant global power while a single hostile state controlled most of continental Europe? For many policymakers, the answer was no. Belgium gave the British government a powerful moral and legal case for intervention. But balance of power politics made intervention strategically compelling as well. So responsibility cannot be reduced to one decision. Austria-Hungary wanted to use the assassination to crush Serbian influence. Germany encouraged Vienna with unconditional support. Russia mobilized to prevent Serbian destruction and preserve its Balkan position. France supported Russia because its own security depended on the alliance. Britain entered because German domination of Europe threatened British interests and because Germany violated Belgian neutrality. Every government believed it had reasons, and every decision narrowed the choices available to the others. That is why the debate over whether Europe sleepwalked into war remains so important. Historian Christopher Clark famously described the leaders of 1914 as sleepwalkers. His argument emphasizes a system in which statesmen acted with incomplete information, misunderstood one another, and repeatedly made choices whose consequences they failed to control. That interpretation captures something important. No government in July 1914 possessed a complete picture of what the next 4 years would look like. Few imagined industrial slaughter on the scale that followed, but describing leaders as sleepwalkers can also make the disaster sound too accidental. Some decisions were deliberate. Austria-Hungary deliberately issued Serbia an ultimatum designed to be extremely difficult to accept. Germany deliberately backed Austria-Hungary. Russian leaders deliberately mobilized. German commanders deliberately implemented a strategy requiring an invasion of Belgium. Governments did not know exactly what would follow, but they knew they were gambling with continental war. Domestic politics made those gambles easier. Germany was experiencing conflict between industrial growth, conservative landowning elites, an expanding working class, and the rising social democratic movement. Some historians have argued that an aggressive foreign policy helped unify a divided society behind nationalism. Germany was not unique in facing internal pressure. Britain was dealing with labor unrest, Irish Home Rule, and the suffragette campaign. France remained deeply divided politically. Russia had barely survived the revolution of 1905 and feared renewed unrest. Austria-Hungary was struggling to govern an empire containing competing nationalities. War could appear to some leaders as a solution. A foreign enemy could unite people who were fighting one another at home, and behind all of those political pressures stood the enormous economic structures Europe had created. Banks financed governments. Governments financed armies. Arms manufacturers supplied those armies. Railways made mass mobilization possible. Industrial companies depended on international supplies and markets. Empires competed for territory and resources. Commercial rivalry did not mechanically cause the First World War, but it shaped the world in which political leaders made their decisions. Economic power had become inseparable from military power. A great power needed steel, coal, oil, shipping, railways, credit colonies, and access to markets. The same industrial system that produced unprecedented prosperity also gave governments the capacity to mobilize millions of men and manufacture weapons on an unimaginable scale. Once war began, that machinery consumed Europe. Roughly 65 million soldiers were mobilized. Millions died in trenches, artillery barrages, naval battles, disease, and hunger. Four great empires disappeared: German, Austro-Hungarian, Russian, and Ottoman. Britain emerged victorious, but financially weakened. France suffered devastating human and physical losses. Germany was defeated, politically shattered, and later burdened with reparations that poisoned European politics. The old economic order did not survive intact either. London's financial supremacy weakened. The United States emerged stronger. The gold standard was disrupted. Debt relationships changed. Revolution transformed Russia. The Ottoman Middle East was divided into new political arrangements whose consequences would last generations. And the settlement of 1919 created new grievances instead of eliminating the old ones. That is why the First World War cannot be explained by one assassin. Gavrilo Princip fired the shots, but he did not build the dreadnoughts. He did not create the alliances. He did not finance Russian railways. He did not design Germany's war plans. He did not carve Africa into competing empires. He did not construct the arms industries or the Baghdad Railway. He did not convince governments that national survival depended on controlling markets, territory, sea lanes, and strategic resources. Those forces had been developing for decades. The assassination transformed them into crisis. Political leaders transformed the crisis into war. The tragedy of 1914 is not that Europe had no alternatives. It is that powerful people repeatedly chose options that made the next escalation more likely. They believed prestige required firmness. They believed alliances required loyalty. They believed mobilization required speed. They believed military advantage might disappear if they waited. They believed their nations could not afford to retreat. Within that logic, every step seemed defensible. Together, those defensible steps produced catastrophe. The First World War, therefore, began long before Sarajevo. It began in the competition for empire, in financial networks linking Paris to St. Petersburg and Berlin to the Ottoman world. In shipyards launching dreadnoughts, in factories manufacturing artillery, in military offices calculating train schedules, in governments increasingly convinced that economic rivalry, political survival, and military power were parts of the same struggle. The bullet in Sarajevo was the match. Europe had spent decades building everything necessary for the fire.